so my project is evaluate the impact of the 3 most significant Formula One innovations over the last 2 decades. So by that, I'm looking at 3 innovations in Formula One that have happened since the 2000s mark, and we've moved into a new era of Formula One. Formula One is the highest form of single-seat motor racing in the world. I'm sure many of you know what Formula One is. So I'll be looking at 3 innovations and seeing how much they've changed Formula One. So my question was initially proposed because I quite like Formula One. I've been watching it since I was 4 years old. There needed to be a lot of data for it because I wanted to do a more qualitative analysis. And I wanted to do my EPQ on Formula One because I hope to go into the automotive industry, and I think it's good proof of interest in cars and motorsport. So I chose my initial title. I altered it slightly to make it more specific because it was originally very, very broad, and I wanted to go into more detailed analysis. One of the things I learned is that 5,000 words is not a lot, and you can't actually write that much in 5,000 words. So my original aims were to evaluate the most impactful innovation, rank the innovations that I've selected, and explain how they work and why they work. Some of my other objectives were to create a short list of innovations that I could do, and I actually use that quite a bit, and be able to explain and describe my title clearly. So there you go. It's quite interesting. That was back in 1950, the Alfa Romeo, and that's the 2020 Alfa Romeo. So the F1 cars have changed quite a lot in that 70 years. Even that's the same team. So my research was mostly made from Google. So I went on Google Scholar and found studies that I did. There was a very useful study by 6 Japanese men who did one on all of Formula One, basically. Very, very useful. I also found on Google Scholar there was other sources that were good as well. There was a lot of magazines, and the Formula One official site was the most useful. I'll go into that later. One of the useful authors I found was Matt Summerfield, who worked with Autosport magazine. He's been working since 2013, and he's done basically every innovation in Formula One since, with a description of how they work and why they work, and some of the impacts that they've had. When I initially started, I was planning on looking at books, specifically by Mark Priestley and Ross Brawn, who is one of the team principals I look at. However, I thought these books were kind of around the point and weren't directly related to what I was doing, so those were scrapped as well. And race replays took a lot of time for me to do, to watch, and although I would have loved to watch them, it probably wasn't the most effective use of my time. This is an example of one of the graphs that I've done. So this just shows the cumulative points for 2 drivers and their team together. I've got this all on an Excel spreadsheet, and I've done all my data like that. So my most reliable source was the Formula One results website. It can't be changed by anyone other than Formula One group who run Formula One. They also have every data that you could imagine from 1950 until nowadays, and is updated every week after each race. There's a lot of data. They're all very accurate. I don't believe it has any biases because it is Formula One and not influenced by anything else. They also have data accessible to no one else, which is very, very useful. An unfortunate thing with it is it doesn't show why drivers didn't finish races. It just shows that they didn't finish races, which is a bit unfortunate, but I don't think it influenced my project much. So I used it as my main source because it was so reliable for standings, points, and times between races. So this was allowed me to compare drivers over the course of the season and teams over the course of seasons or years. This is an example, so I can see the 2009 team standings, which teams finished where. This resolution is really bad on PowerPoint. And it gives me the points, number of wins. I can also look at the race results for a race, so which driver finished first or second. And it's really, really in-depth. So my least reliable sources was a YouTube video and a Facebook post. So the YouTube video was by F1 Enthusiast, who is anonymous. The video has 1.2 million views, and the YouTube channel has 836 subscribers. I used it only for the commentary, as it is a live snippet from the actual race. I used it for images, commentary from the people, from the commentators, and for a slow motion shot that they used. I used the Facebook post because this is the helmet of one of the drivers after a collision. It's not particularly nice. The user has 350,000 followers, so it wasn't a huge post, but it was posted on Facebook in 2018. The Hungarian, these were both actually the same collision, I think about it, was published in 2020 and 2018, so they are fairly new, so I used them. So about my project, the first innovation that I chose was the F-duct. It was quite a complicated system because you couldn't see much of it, but the driver was basically able to change the airflow over the rear of the car using his hand here, and it's not against the well, it wasn't against the regulations for the driver to alter airflow. It was a great innovation because it was brought in a new concept that hadn't been used before. It led to a massive technical race at the time because teams were complaining about the system of McLaren while also developing their own. And there was a large variety of different ways that people took it, and it also led to DRS. A couple of the negatives were it was quite unsafe because the driver normally changes the settings with his right hand, and that's where you control the system. So if he messed it up, he'd go into a corner with one hand on the wheel with the wrong settings, and not particularly a great idea to do. So that was why it was eventually banned. Also discouraged overtaking because teams would rather overtake on the straight when it was less risky. There was also large gaps in performance because of how many different designs there were. It was banned after one season, so it wasn't able to have its true influence because of its safety concerns. But it did lead to DRS, which increased average overtaking and led to another thing that the drivers have to learn and be skilled on. Negatives, it discouraged standard overtaking and led to overtaking on straights, which you will see now in Formula 1. Because DRS is still around to this day. This is a qualitative analysis mostly. I used a lot of data. I created 4 different factors that I included to be able to compare each of the innovations together. This graph isn't the clearest, but there's a big gain here in 2010 with the F-duct than before the F-duct, showing that the F-duct had quite a large impact on McLaren. Next up was the double diffuser. This is the second one that I did. Again, it was more of a qualitative analysis. You can see there in the red box, there's that little section there, which increased the volume of the rear diffuser, which meant they got more downforce and more grip. So some of the positives were that it allowed teams to regain and develop the performance they would have lost after the regulations as the FIA tried to slow down the cars. The team that first introduced it won the team championship and the drivers' championship, even though before they'd won 3 races and had one race win and 1 podium, went on to win both the titles. So it was a massive, massive impact for them as a team. It also encouraged investment because after Brawn GP, the team that started it was sold. It was bought by Mercedes, who have now won 7 consecutive Constructors' Championships, so they are very, very powerful. Some of the negatives, cars were very fast, which was also a decrease in safety. There was also a performance gap, as there were so many different designs, many teams with different objectives, and it led to a few teams being even faster and a few teams being slower still. It didn't lead to anything. It was banned after 1 season, and we haven't really heard much from it since. This is how the diffuser works. It allows the air at the bottom to move faster, creating lower pressure, sucking the car to the ground, and it also reduces the drag down the straights because the air is able to go into this vacuum zone here. This is an example of the graph that I used for the Brawn, the double diffuser. So this was with the double diffuser, with the same 4 factors as the F-duct. So as you can see, before the double diffuser, they weren't doing particularly good. And then with the diffuser, there was a massive spike in performance here. And then afterwards, they returned to their pretty bad form. Finally is the Halo, which is still around to this day. This was a more qualitative analysis. So I used more magazines, and I talked to people who also had an interest in Formula 1 to get their opinions. So this is a three-pointed star that fits onto the top of the halo, on top of the chassis, and this protects the driver here from any large debris such as cars. Positive, it saved Charles Leclerc in this crash here. This wheel here would have gone right into his head. So the halo broke the suspension and deflected the impact, saving his life. There's also this crash here that happened last year at the end of the season. That's where the driver sits in there. I don't know if you can see the laser pointer. But it's a very, very bad crash. And the original reason why the halo wasn't introduced was because many people thought that it would stop the driver being able to exit the car because it was another restriction above them. However, Romain Grosjean's car set on fire at about 900 degrees Celsius because the fuel tank exploded and the car split in two. He was able to escape within 23 seconds, and he was in the medical car and on his way to the pit lane within 28. He was fine. He suffered severe injuries in both of his hands, minor injuries anywhere else. He's now in IndyCar and is racing. He won his first race the other week as well. So this showed that it's very durable and it doesn't restrict the driver. The positives were it's a great improvement to safety and makes the races far more exciting because no one wants to see their favourite driver die. A development area where teams could really improve their cars and separate them and make them more individual.
Hang on just a second. If anyone does need to go immediately, you can go now quietly. Otherwise, you're going to go 5 more minutes.
Am I good for
5 minutes.
Okay. Negatives was this race. This is the Facebook post that I showed earlier. The halo has large holes in it, which allows small debris. So this was a spring off the back of one of the other vehicles that Massa hit, and it ricocheted into his head in the cockpit. He wasn't seriously injured. He was taken to hospital, but he is fine. He's actually racing in Formula E. It was quite against when it first came out because it ended open cockpit racing, which is what Formula 1 has always been. Even from the original results, there is nothing above the driver. They sometimes wore a leather cap, but that was far too safe most of the time. It also led to another listed part that teams couldn't create themselves, so it made the cars very similar. A couple of the successes that I thought I had was I simplified a lot of the advanced topics. The diffuser and the F-duct can go into quite a lot of detail and can be quite hard to explain. I believe I've done that quite well, and I believe that if you know absolutely nothing about aerodynamics or vehicular dynamics, I think you'll be fine. I also think I was able to educate people from not knowing an awful lot about Formula 1 and cars to a reasonable level. A couple of the failures that I had in my project that I would love to have redone was not as in-depth as anticipated. I thought I was going to be able to fit more. I was planning on analysing 4 or 5 innovations, but I ran out of words. And it wasn't able to be quite as in-depth as I wanted. So the descriptions were quite limited because I realised a lot of people don't actually know an awful lot about vehicular dynamics, which is a bit unfortunate. And I unfortunately used quite a lot of qualitative sources at the start. However, I did change this and use a lot more quantitative. So the couple of the changes I had was the changes in simplification. I also was planning on doing another innovation known as the blown diffuser. However, that was a difficult one because it had never been phased out or banned. It had only ever been somewhat discouraged at times, and teams are somewhat using it now, so data is quite limited on it. And it's hard to define what is and without the blown diffuser. So that's why I chose the Halo, and that's why it's a bit different to all the other innovations. So a couple of the improvements that I would have liked to have made, that I did make, and I had to cut out because of the word limit, was more detailed. So Raw and GP had the double diffuser. Originally I had quite a long section talking about how they were bought for £1 and sold by Honda during the financial crisis. However, this took up quite a lot of words. I also would like to have taken into account mechanical and race DNFs and weather. However, that's a lot of factors that I wasn't able to put in because of word count.
1 minute max.
1 minute, okay. Yes, I also would love to compare driver skill because driver changes occurred and be able to discuss more recent innovations, but time. So in the future, I plan to do automotive engineering and design, so it's proof of passion, skills in critical analysis, and proof of ability to understand vehicular dynamics. In terms of what I've developed my self-motivation. I've learned referencing, how to do it well, hopefully, how to work independently, writing in a professional tone, and proofreading. I've also improved my organisation skills by quite a lot. Yes, thank you for listening.